Hello, thank you so much for joining me and your interest in my work. My name is Dr. Jamelia Blake, and I'm a professor at Texas A&M University. Today, I'm going to present on a project that I have been engaging in with my colleagues, Minor Marchbanks and Anthony Peguero. And we're going to be discussing the educational significance of in-school suspension. And the question we're interested in is, what is the tipping point as it relates to academic failure? Before I get started on the presentation, I need to acknowledge and thank our funders, the National Institute of Justice, who supported this work. I also need to thank the Texas Education Research Center at the University of Texas at Austin and the Texas Juvenile Justice Department that provided us with access to the data for the study that we are going to discuss shortly. I want to reiterate that the views and opinions offered in this presentation are a reflection of the authors of this presentation only and do not reflect the opinions of the National Institute of Justice or the Texas Education Research Center. The work that I'm presenting today is drawn from a published study that was developed by my wonderful co-authors who are featured here. And I have, of course, they couldn't be with me today to present this work, but they've given me permission to do so. And so I've included their name and contact information, as well as a link to the actual publication at the top. And if you scan this QR code, you should be able to pull up that publication and see it. But I wanted to acknowledge my colleagues for their excellent contribution and for leading this important work. So before I get started, I just want to go over some terminology very quickly. I'm not sure about the range of expertise or familiarity with these concepts. Hopefully, there are people from all different disciplines, industries, taking time out to view this presentation. But as someone who studies this often and heavily, I find myself using terms synonymously that maybe might confuse people, hopefully not. So when we talk about school discipline broadly, we're talking about exclusionary discipline, which includes suspension. In-school suspension is suspension in which a student is removed from the classroom but still inside the school setting, and out-of-school suspension in which a student is receiving their sanction outside of the school. Expulsion is removal from the school for a more significant amount of time. And discipline alternative education placement and juvenile justice alternative education placement is when the student is placed in another school setting as a response to their sanction, usually for mandatory discipline events that are very severe, or they're usually placed there for frequent events. In the case of juvenile justice, it might be also related to the discipline incident involving a criminal act. And then academic achievement, can be measured in many ways. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm usually talking about statewide standardized achievement tests that are usually given at the state level. And sometimes I might refer to it as grade point average. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on some of this background information because I feel like my colleagues and the broader public have done a good job of making it known that the way that we handle student misbehavior has become a national problem, particularly when we use school suspension, in the sense that we not only are suspending a significant number of students, but there are also racial and gender disparities in the suspension of students based on students' representation in the United States. So when you look at this figure, the percentages within the United States represent the number of Black male and females we have that are at school age, and this is from 2015 to 2016, which is a little bit dated, but we don't have more recent data available yet. It'll be coming soon. And there are about 13% Latino males and Latina females, but what we see is that in terms of suspensions, 25% of Black males are suspended, 14% of Black females, and 15% of Latino males and 6% of Latina females. So students are being suspended at higher rates in their representation in public schools, which is one of the reasons why people have given so much attention to looking at school discipline and how we handle it. The other reason why we have spent significant time, energy, and resources to understanding the disciplining of students is because of the educational consequences. School suspension in particular, but also other forms of discipline result in a loss of instructional time. When kids are removed from the classroom, they're not receiving the instruction, they're not learning. And when they're not learning, that contributes to academic underachievement, and that can result in a student being retained a grade if they're not making academic progress. And in some instances, in older students, we see that over-discipline is associated with high school dropout. So in essence, the overuse of school suspension is widening what we call the racial ethnic achievement gap or opportunity gap, because we find that Black and Latinx students are over-disciplined more so, as well as Native American students are over-disciplined more so than white students. And those students have historically performed lower on national metrics of academic achievement. And so when you add in over-disciplining and the academic consequences of that, loss of instructional time, that increases the likelihood that this racial ethnic and achievement gap is widening, that school suspension is contributing to that. So the good news is that particularly in the last 7 years, schools, organizations, there have been a number of policies that have been implemented in response to address over suspension, right? So for example, there are school districts that have banned school suspension for certain infractions or for certain grade levels. Schools are engaging in a number of proactive, alternative approaches to discipline that are not punitively based. You see restorative practices being used, positive behavior intervention and supports, a system-wide proactive behavior management program, social emotional learning programs are being used. You know, the verdict is still out on how effective these are in reducing racial ethnic disparities in school suspension, but what we do know is that they do reduce suspension overall. So there's a lot of promise there. Something that also has happened as a result from moving away from suspension, primarily out of school suspension, is that some districts may rely more so on in-school suspensions, right? So one question that my team was interested in exploring was very loosely, is in-school suspension an appropriate alternative, right, to out-of-school suspension? Because as I mentioned, in-school suspension removes the student from the classroom, but not the school, right? So it's possible that the student would still be getting instructional time, and it creates a safe space because students are continued to be supervised and monitored, right? So in essence, there are some people who kind of see in-school suspension as being less harmful to students, and therefore a possible alternative for managing behavioral infractions in the school setting. But the research and the verdict is still out on that. There are some scholars, at least one in 2018, that found in-school suspension was associated with lower GPA, a grade point average, and greater high school dropout, which implies that in-school suspension might be just as detrimental to students' academic achievement as out-of-school suspension. And that was really interesting to me, and it led me and my team to consider how we evaluate the educational significance of some of the discipline practices that we are engaging in. And so what we were really curious in understanding is, when does in-school suspension result in academic failure? Because on the surface, at face value, it would seem that in-school suspension would actually not be harmful, right? And so we wanted to ask a different question and explore the dosage of in-school suspension, right? Or what's the tipping point? What's the threshold in which how many in-school suspensions are detrimental to students? And this is a more nuanced question that I think that the field hasn't traditionally looked at, but I think it's important because it has practical implications for individuals who have to make these decisions, right? So should we throw the baby out with the bathwater, or do we need to better understand under what conditions could a strategy be helpful or hurtful, right? And so this question takes a very small step to evaluating what is the tipping point, or how many in-school suspensions result in academic failure. So by virtue of the NIJ grant we were funded with, we actually had access to a significant amount of data from the Texas Educational Agency. And so we were able to explore our questions with students in Texas who were enrolled in public school. And again, Texas is a very large state, and with 1 in 10 public school students in the US being enrolled in a Texas school district. And it's a diverse state in terms of the demographic population of students in K through 12. So it's an excellent laboratory for examining some of these questions we have about the nature of school discipline and its impact on broader implications. So our data set actually drew from the Texas Education Agency and the Texas Juvenile Probation Commission and juvenile justice records. However, for the purpose of this particular study, we only focus on data from the Texas Education Agency, from their PEEM system and their student record variables. Particularly, the variables of interest were drawn from student demographic data, student achievement scores, specifically students' performance on a state standardized achievement measure. We collected or evaluated whether students passed or failed. Of course, we looked at students' disciplinary sanctions, if they received in-school suspension, and we accounted for students' eligibility for free reduced lunch status, as well as campus characteristics. So I want to, even though our sample is actually very large, and we actually have access to data from two cohorts of students from kindergarten all the way to their completion of high school, for this study, we focused on only 9th grade students in a single year. And our decision to focus on 9th grade students was because of the measures of the state standardized, or the subjects of the state standardized test that they would be administered, and because it would be the same. So in order to understand how many in-school suspensions result in academic failure, or another way to say this is, what is the educational significance of in-school suspension, right? We did a few things. As I mentioned before, our sample focused just on ninth graders for a single year. The ninth graders in our sample had never had an out-of-school suspension, an expulsion, or placement in a discipline alternative education setting or a juvenile justice alternative education setting. So us focusing on ninth graders who only had in-school suspension allowed us to have a pure sample and to account for any noise that might have occurred if we had included other students with other discipline sanction. In total, our final data analytics sample was 360,826 students. In addition to looking at how many in-school suspensions were issued to a student before they failed a test, we accounted for characteristics of their school campus. Were they in a Title I school or not? As I mentioned, we accounted for their free reduced lunch eligibility. We also controlled for if they had ever failed a standardized test before the ninth grade to account for any academic difficulties. So to examine how many in-school suspensions can be issued before a student fails a state standardized test in ninth grade, we looked at students who had in-school suspensions in the first 4 grading periods of the academic year. So usually in Texas, state standardized tests could be administered in the last 3 months of the academic year, starting as early as March and ending in May. And so to make sure that we had, we didn't account for students getting in-school suspensions after they took the test, we only included students in school suspensions before March. And when we looked at standardized tests for the date range that we had access to the data, we actually used the Texas Assessment of Knowledge and Skills, which is called the TAKS. And we used the math and the reading scores. And we recoded this measure to determine whether a student, the probability a student who had ISS would fail one test, either math or reading, or both. So in addition to exploring how many in-school suspensions could be issued before a student failed a standardized test, we also examined if this association differed by racial ethnic background. So we looked to see if the probability was the same for Black, Latinx, and white students. And here's what we found. So before we even looked at any issuance of in-school suspensions, what we find is that, so let me explain this graph, before I go into detail. So this is a graph of our major findings, not the significance testing. You can look at that in the actual peer-reviewed article. For simplicity, I'm only going to discuss this graphic so I can be applicable to a range of viewers who do or do not have expertise in statistics. So I should say that all of our predictions were significant. But in this graph, what you'll find is on the x-axis, you'll have the number of in-school suspensions that a student could get based on their, or were issued based on their racial, ethnic, demographic background. And on the left, you have the probability of them failing the standardized achievement test for the state of Texas. So the gray box represents the probability of failing one test, and the maroon represents the probability of failing 2 tests, if that makes sense. So for students who hadn't had any in-school suspensions, what we found is that the probability for failure is actually higher for Black and Latinx students. So what this means is without any discipline, these students are already at risk for not passing the reading or math or both state standardized tests, right? And so right out the gate, these Black and Latinx students are already at a disadvantage academically. And this is a reflection of what we mean by the racial ethnic achievement gap, where Black and Latino, or excuse me, Black and Latinx students are performing lower on standardized academic performance. And that is beyond discussing about what drives that is beyond the scope of this particular presentation. But I wanted to show that in transparency to say that the risk is already higher for these students. And I think most administrators at the campus and the district level know that when they look at their data, they can already see this happening for some subsets of students. So for students who are issued their first in-school suspension, what we see is that the probability of failing the state standardized test is actually higher, is the highest for Black students, followed by Latinx students. So there's almost, not quite, probably about a 27% chance that Black students who get an in-school suspension, just one, are going to fail that test. And the probability is a little bit lower for Latinx students. When we move to having 2 in-school suspensions, we see again that the same pattern emerges, but that Black students' risk for failing standardized tests exceeds 30%. So there's a 30% chance that Black students with 2 in-school suspensions are going to not pass both of their standardized tests. And we see that the rate is a little bit lower for Latinx students. So what happens when we look at students who have more than 3 in-school suspension? Well, what we see happens is actually now the risk for failure is actually 30% higher for white students. So white students have a 30% chance of failing the TAKS, the State Standardized Achievement Test, when they have 3 in-school suspensions. And the rate goes up even more for all students, but white, Black, and Latinx, for those students who have 5 or more in-school suspensions, right? So what we're seeing is that the more in-school suspensions a student has, regardless of their race, there's a greater likelihood that they are not going to pass at least 1, but possibly 2 state standardized achievement tests. So why does that matter? Well, that's a big deal. That's a big deal when we're engaging in a practice that could actually be detrimental to the academic performance and achievement of our students. And although, again, on face value, it seems that we would think that in-school suspension would not be harmful, it seems that in-school suspension is very much the sister of out-of-school suspension and is contributing to the racial, ethnic achievement gap, as well as out-of-school suspension. But why would that occur? The answer is, I don't know. I mean, it's perplexing, but we certainly aren't the only group of scholars that have found that. And so it begs the question of what's really happening when students get in-school suspension. And it leads us to more, so really good research, you know, this will probably sound a little bit like a cop-out, but it's true, and I'm a data nerd, but good research studies lead to more questions, because more questions lead to more solutions. So, you know, this makes me wonder, and our team wonder, is, so if we have students in school, right? So I'm a licensed psychologist, I didn't share that, but I'm also a school psychologist. So I've worked in schools in practice. So I have a pretty good sense of what happens in schools in terms of discipline. I'm not just in the ivory tower hanging out and crunching numbers all day. But so what happens with in-school suspension is usually when a kid is removed from the classroom, they're placed into another room that's monitored by an adult. The adult doesn't necessarily have to be a teacher. They're usually, they usually have a title of behavior specialist, or they're a paraprofessional, but they're there, they're full-time, and the student is given their classroom work, and they're expected to do that work. And this is probably something I shouldn't share, but having worked in schools, I've actually had some of my students tell me how they like in-school suspension because it's less distraction and they can get their work done. But the question is, what's happening? Are the work products that those kids are doing in-school suspension at the same level? Is it because even if they are getting the work without direct instruction, is no direct instruction causing the greater academic loss in academic gains in terms of performance on standardized tests? Another question that this leads us to is this not about maybe, the declines in academic performance that we see in-school suspension as well as out-of-school suspension? Maybe it's more about when we remove kids from their traditional routine, this increases academic disengagement. So maybe it's not about the amount of instruction they get at all, but maybe it's about the climate issue. I mean, these are all questions, unfortunately, I don't have the answer to, but I think are worthy of exploration. And, if time permitted, I could sit here and think of so many more, as I'm sure you can. But, as I said, good research leads to interesting questions. But all research has limitations, and this study is no exception. So one of the challenges or the limitations of our study is that we focus on a single academic year. We did that for simplicity because when you start looking at state standardized achievement tests, particularly at Texas and the date range, two things happen. The type of test that students were given shifted, and also in that it became a different type of state standardized achievement test, and also the subject matters were different by year, right? So it's possible that, we have missed something because we've not examined, by looking at a single academic year, we've not been able to tap in the cumulative effects of discipline and academic problems. So we haven't gotten to see, if we had looked at how many in-school suspensions a student got per year, accounting for prior discipline outcomes, how would that impact their risk or probability for failure on a state standardized achievement test? We haven't, in our study, accounted for the cumulative effects of discipline and academic problems. And I don't know which way that would go. I mean, I think that's a worthy follow-up question for any ambitious scholar who wants to explore it. I've said this, if you've ever listened to me speak in other presentations, but that heavy sigh is because I struggle with this. I do wonder if standardized test performance is the best indicator of academic achievement or academic failure from both a practice perspective, but also from a researcher and policy perspective. And I'm just wondering if we should replicate this study, or someone should replicate this study and consider multiple indicators of academic achievement, right? And another thing that is related to that point is that when we do these analyses, although we have this rich, amazing data set that can result in significant policy implications, we are looking at this from a bird's eye view. And so we can't catch some of the decision-making, the nuances that happen with decisions surrounding academic performance and what are indicators of failure. This is not necessarily a limitation, but it is something that I've been reflecting on and considering, and it's a broader question, I think, that has implications for all of us in education. It really is, what is the threshold for evaluating the impact of our educational practices or policies? Should students' performance on standardized achievement tests be the metric, right? And what probability is acceptable? What risk of failure are we comfortable with? You know, we found that with 3 or more in-school suspensions, at least for one academic year for ninth graders, if students had 3 or more in-school suspensions, they had a 30% chance of failing standardized tests. Is that a level that we're comfortable with? Is 30% risk of failure appropriate? What's threshold? How high is too high? How low is too low? What is reasonable? What percentage of students do we anticipate, you know, accounting for a variety of factors, are going to fail, or margin of error because we have measurement error in our tests, are going to fail these tests and we're okay, versus what percentage of students indicate that we're engaging in practices that are problematic and maybe inadvertently harmful to our students. Welcome to my brain and the things that I stay up at night thinking about. I mean, these are interesting questions, and I'd love to, it's unfortunate that this is a recorded presentation, because I think this would have been an amazing conversation had we had the opportunity to do so in person. However, if you have some thoughts about this, I would love to engage with you on social media through Twitter. You know, happy to share my kind of not fully developed ideas about this, but thoughts. Also, please feel free to email me or any of the co-authors of the study about these research questions. Here I've provided all of the co-authors' name and contact information if they're on social media, as well as a QR code to our Google Scholar pages. I mentioned this, I think, earlier in the presentation, but maybe I didn't. But if theoretically, I've never did a QR code through a video, but theoretically, if you put your phone up and scan this QR code, it should link you to our Google Scholar page, where you can see some of the other publications that we've done and follow our work. But it also, more importantly, if you are not in academia or do not have access to a library that has databases that publish the article that the study is drawn from, or if you can't get behind the paywall, Google Scholar often, not always, but often, I don't know how they do it, find full text citations. So if you're interested in any of our work, definitely link to our Google Scholar page. However, if that's not an option for you, you can always email me directly. I'm sure my colleagues would agree as well, for any manuscript that I've written, and I'd be happy to send you a copy. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for your interest in this work. Please stay connected and interested, engage, and reach out if I can be of help to you. Have a wonderful day. Oh, I don't know how to stop. Goodbye.